Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, obviously from the Sirius report, and today we're going to discuss why the European Union is on its last legs and why it was doomed before its very inception, and ultimately we are where we are today for all the reasons we're going to discuss. Now, firstly, historically, why was the European Union formed? This is not a generally accepted consensus, but this came out of the back end of the situation where the Berlin Wall came down. East Germany collapsed effectively, and then there was a desire to have unification between East and West Germany. And in order for that to happen, and this was a United States diktat, you will have to dispense with the Deutschmark, you will have to adopt the euro, and you will lead to the construction of the European Union. And the reason for this was because the United States was deeply fearful of a united Germany rotating east and integrating with Russia and broader Eurasia. Of course, that subsequently has proved to be the case thus far. Now we're in 2024. But it was doomed for the following reasons. Because it was a political union rather than an economic and financial union, which is exactly what it should have been from the old European economic market, which was a place where everyone could freely trade and benefit from that ability to still have sovereignty, make your own decisions, but trade, commerce, and obviously benefit financially in the process as well. Another problem is sticking in countries in the European Union who should never have been included. And they failed the Maastricht criteria. Even countries like Italy did so, but everyone was dragged in because it was a political union as a sort of support for NATO as well, in a broader sense, and also just effectively controlled by the European Commission, centrally controlled at the behest of the United States, where countries, of course, would lose their sovereignty and their right to self-determination. Now, that's just a bit of historical background. Then you come on to key factors for its failure. Well, basically the entire political system. As say this diktat from the European Commission, where individual countries do not have politicians in place who best interests relate to the sovereignty of those countries. That's not entirely the case, but largely the case. The other thing you can't have is a single central bank setting policy rate decisions like interest rates. Simply not feasible, doesn't work, and could never have worked. The other thing you can't have is a European currency for all countries with such disparate economies. So what might work for Germany certainly was never going to work for Greece, Spain, Portugal, etc. And that's why we had the sovereign debt crisis 2011-2012 for this very reason. And Europe has ever since had huge problems trying to marry all these disparate economies with common, what you might term monetary policy decisions as a result of it. Another problem that obviously, because of a lack of sovereignty and effectively being a vassal of the United States, European countries are not allowed to have and make their own decisions that are for the benefit of their own nation states and people. So they can't decide whether they want to have a relationship with China, with Russia and Iran, whatever people's political persuasion is. This is a statement of fact. Another problem is they always get sucked into unnecessary trade wars at the behest of the United States. Europe and China is one obvious example recently, but it's far from the only one. The other thing is they then also have no choice but to get sucked into US foreign policy debacles, whether they're a member of NATO or a member of the European Union. Look at how much money the European Union has given to the Ukraine war when they can ill afford to do so given all the problems that these nations have collectively, as well as problems inside the broader European Union. Other obvious problems that the European Union lacks and these nations lack is a lack of innovation and investment, relying on traditional industries that have long since ceased to be profitable, and consequently just resting on laurels of for decades, well, things worked, so why do we have to change? There are clearly demographic problems and immigration problems, and I have to be careful when I say this because I don't share some of the extreme sentiment of people with regards to immigration, but clearly we've reached a point for European nations where immigration is a problem. These nations have got their own problems to sort out economically, financially, societally, and trying to take in more immigrants is just simply unsustainable. The other big problem, and Germany is a great example of this across European countries, is traditional industries are basically dying off. They cease to be profitable. And because of this lack of innovation and investment in new technologies, countries like China are now stealing a march, and Europe is miles behind. And without this lack of innovation, it causes huge problems for the future economy, and obviously with a lack of jobs, and because of the lack of investment in countries that could invest in European countries but aren't allowed to do so, China being an obvious example, just impedes the future growth, prosperity, and the very survival of the European Union itself. Other problems clearly across the whole Eurozone is massive overregulation, and this is compounded by this lack of sovereignty, so decisions are made at the European Commission that are just wholly incompatible with the needs of individual nations. Other problems, and this ongoing problems, a cost of living crisis, inflationary problems. This causes a lack of consumption via disposable income, and consumption, whether you agree or disagree, is a significant component of Western economies. There is also this dependence on endless cheap credit and this fake economies via all the financialization, which is ultimately brought about the destruction of the real economy. We have unsustainable debt. We have all these asset bubbles created by financialization, which have to be propped up at any costs. Hence why we had this very crass and idiotic QE stroke zero interest rate policy, which is totally unsustainable unless you implement it on a short-term basis. Another problem which is manifests itself across all European countries is a massive government share of their economy is endemic, and also their economies are fueled by debt, credit bubbles, also incompetent governance, a total lack of a meritocratic structure, which means we don't have politicians in place who are fit to govern. We have people who are in place to do as they're told and not to rock the boat, so you can't say anything that's detrimental to the European Union, and therefore you can't say anything that's in the best interest of the specific nation that you represent. And also, of course, we don't really have a true opposition politically, because every time you vote a different political parties in, then nothing changes. And we've seen this for decades in European countries, but also throughout the course of the European Union's existence. Of course, the argument is, can that change in the future? Well, potentially, but that requires a massive sea change in people's voting patterns and a belief that whilst we will support protest votes for so-called populist parties, do they really trust them to govern countries? And thus far, that has not been seen to be the case largely. The other trouble in Europe is all ideologically driven policy. There's an absolute hatred of Russia, way before the Ukraine war. And ultimately, another example is Europe, whether it likes it or not, whether it sticks in their throat or not, needs cheap Russian energy to survive. Without it, the alternatives are not going to help them in any way, shape or form, because if they buy energy from the Americans, it's going to cost 3, 4, 5 times as much. That's not sustainable in already very weak economies. And the irony, of course, is they've continued to buy Russian energy despite sanctions being in place, but they're buying LNG through back doors, and it's costing them far more than if they just had pipeline Russian gas. But of course, Nord Stream was blown up and the rest's history. The other thing they are is incapable of driving ongoing and future real economic growth. There's a lack of real entrepreneurship. In fact, it's largely stymied unless your face fits. Your business ideas will be squashed, particularly if they're damaging to existing corporations. The other problem you've got is you're going to have, whether people like it or not, there's going to be a need, and has been, for massive future state spending that's ongoing and required. That has to be financed in some way, and it can't be. And I'm not suggesting that's how it should be. That's how it has been, and it will be. And that often then is detrimental and causes inflationary problems. It damages the euro currency, and ultimately is not beneficial to the economy in any way. All these mandates from what I call central government, meaning Brussels and the European Commission, is one of the biggest problems Europe's faced. It has to end. European countries need to retain their sovereignty, and the European Commission should not exist in the current format it does. Okay, that's a very difficult question to answer, particularly in a podcast of this nature, but that's something maybe to discuss in the future and assess what the possibilities could probably be. So the obvious next question is, and bear in mind this is not an exhaustive list, it's just to give people some idea of the magnitude of the problems and how they cannot be resolved. There's no way you can fix the economy, you can fix the financial system, all the societal problem without a massive overhaul, which includes either radically reforming the European Union as it exists now or ending it. Ending it is, of course, hugely problematical in of itself, but the changes required are enormous. There is a huge lack of infrastructure across Europe to support future technological change, and the technological change needs huge investment. Where's that coming from? You can't do just printing money. There needs to be huge changes in things like education, in the healthcare system. There's two obvious examples, and there's a multitude of other sectors that need a huge change in that regard. There needs to be massive investment. There needs to be the ability to innovate. There need to have light government, whether it's sovereign-based, and if the European Union survives, the European Commission needs to be stripped of many of its existing powers, and then it becomes something that's supposed to serve the interests of the collective rather than dictating to the collective as a political entity at the behest of the United States. The other thing is you need domestically political parties who represent the people. Now you have to be very careful we don't veer from traditional parties to populist parties who ultimately will not serve the needs of the people. The other thing you need to do is have people with the right political credentials that people trust as an alternative. And people generally are very adverse to change. And what I mean by change is not voting in the opposition the next time there's an election, but ditching all the traditional political parties and seeing that there is an alternative. You certainly need low taxation regimes. High taxation, very damaging. But when you have a state that is largely burdened by enormous government, including spending, regulation, that is a huge problem. The other thing European countries need to do is retain their sovereignty, be able to make decisions, sign deals with whichever countries in the world they want to sign. Whether the European Commission or the United States agrees with that, it's not their concern, and it never should be. But it has been, and that is hugely damaging to the prospects of individual nations. The other thing is, ultimately, NATO serves no purpose now in light of the Ukraine war. That's going to upset some people. He says, but we need to protect ourselves because Russia's going to invade us. Russia's not going to invade NATO countries and has no desire whatsoever to do so. This is just something that is designed to create this bogeyman. Russia's the bogeyman, principally because the United States doesn't want Europe to integrate into Eurasia, into the multipolar world as things are now. But traditionally, it was to stop Germany integrating with Russia. NATO's not required. We need to stop pretending we have fictitious enemies. Yes, the Ukraine war suggests to the contrary, but when the war's over, there needs to be strenuous efforts to end NATO as it is. You want to have a defence force, then have some sensible discussions about this, but NATO serves no purpose whatsoever. It just creates enormous problems domestically. It means they're all having to agree to increase their military defence budgets in ways they can't afford to do so. We should be spending less militarily in resolving these difficulties. That is a thorny subject. Many people will not agree with what I'm saying. But overall, in a very sort of quick-fire sense, the duration of this podcast, this explains reasons why the European Union is indeed doomed to failure. And nothing can be done to resolve these problems unless you have this radical overhaul. Because you've got a model that was never going to work. It's certainly proved in its very short and brief existence to be a total failure. But Europe needs to look after its own interests and stop being a vassal state of the United States, whose interests are only what serves the United States. They're not interested in what benefits Europe, so they're happy to use Europe as a tool to attack Russia, to attack China, or anyone else it deems is not playing the ball with regards to US hegemony, which of course, as we said previously, is dead on its feet also. And with that, we end today's podcast. Thank you very much for all of your support. Please like, share and subscribe and try help us to grow this channel so we can inform people instead of people being entertained. And with that, I'll say goodbye.